They walked into that restaurant thinking they were fighting for a $10 billion empire. They thought the test was about profit margins, stock options, and ruthless negotiation. They were wrong. The old billionaire Albert Sterling didn't care about their resumes. He was watching something else entirely. He was watching how they treated the one person in the room they thought didn't matter, the waitress. And by the time dessert was served, lives were ruined, a fortune was transferred, and the most powerful people in New York were brought to their knees by a spilled glass of water. The rain in Manhattan wasn't just falling, it was punishing the pavement. It was a cold November Tuesday, the kind of night where the city lights blur into streaks of aggressive neon against the wet asphalt. Inside the Gilded Lily, arguably the most exclusive dining establishment on the Upper East Side, the weather was irrelevant. In Hadamard, the air smelled of truffle oil, aged mahogany, and silent, terrifying money. Sarah Miller adjusted her apron in the server's station, her hands trembling slightly. She checked her reflection in the polished brass of the espresso machine. She looked tired. At 24, she carried the exhaustion of a woman twice her age. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe bun, complying with the strict dress code, but it couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. She touched the pocket of her trousers, feeling the vibration of her phone. She ignored it. She knew who it was. It was the billing department of St. Jude's Cardiac Center. Her mother's surgery was scheduled for Friday, and Sarah was short. Specifically, she was $4,000 short. If she didn't come up with the deposit by Thursday morning, they would lose their slot, and her mother would go back to the bottom of the waiting list, a list she might not survive waiting on. Miller, the hiss came from Henri, the floor manager. Henri was a short man with a mustache so perfectly waxed it looked like a weapon. He didn't like Sarah. He thought she was too soft, too distracted. Yes, Henri? Sarah straightened up, forcing a smile. Table 1. The obsidian room, Henri whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence. Mr. Sterling is here, and he has guests. The blood drained from Sarah's face. The obsidian room was a private dining area separated from the main floor by soundproof glass and velvet curtains. It was reserved for heads of state and royalty, but tonight it was reserved for Albert Sterling. Everyone knew the name. Albert Sterling was 82 years old, the CEO of Sterling Industries, a conglomerate that owned everything from shipping lines to pharmaceutical patents. He was worth an estimated $12 billion. He was also known for being ruthless, eccentric, and currently dying. Rumors had been swirling in the financial tabloids for weeks. Sterling had no children. His wife had passed a decade ago. The question of who would inherit the throne of Sterling Industries was the hottest topic on Wall Street. I need your best service, Mahler, Henri snapped, dusting invisible lint off Sarah's shoulder. No mistakes. If you drop so much as a spoon, don't bother coming back to the kitchen. Just keep walking out the front door. I understand, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She needed the tips from tonight. If Sterling was as rich as they said, maybe, just maybe, a miracle would happen. She picked up the heavy silver tray, loaded with crystal water pitchers, and pushed through the heavy velvet curtains into the obsidian room. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a crystal chandelier and the flickering candlelight on the table. At the head of the table sat Albert Sterling. He looked frail, his skin like parchment paper wrapped in a tuxedo that seemed a size too big for his shrinking frame. But his eyes were sharp, glacial blue, and unblinking. To his right sat Richard Sterling, his nephew. Richard was 40, dressed in a suit that cost more than Sarah made in a year. He had a face that was handsome but spoiled, with a mouth that naturally rested in a sneer. To Albert's left was Julianne Vane, the vice president of operations. She was striking, with raven black hair and diamonds dripping from her ears. She was tapping her long, manicured fingernails on the table, looking at her watch. And across from her sat Brad Holloway, the young hotshot CFO. Brad was barely 30, arrogant, and currently typing on his phone under the table. Water, Richard barked without looking up as Sarah approached. Certainly, sir, Sarah whispered. She moved with the grace of a dancer, pouring the water without a splash. As she moved around the table, she became invisible. They didn't look at her. They didn't pause their conversation. To them, she was a robot arm attached to a pitcher. "So, Uncle Artie," Richard said, leaning back and swirling his empty wine glass, "why the cloak and dagger? You drag us out here in this weather. We have the merger meeting in the morning." Albert Sterling didn't answer immediately. He watched Sarah place a napkin he had accidentally knocked slightly askew back into its perfect position. "I'm dying, Richard," Albert said softly. His voice was raspy, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. Brad stopped texting. Julianne froze. "We know you're unwell, Albert," Julianne said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "That's why we've been taking on so much of the load, to let you rest." "I don't need rest," Albert snapped. "I need an air." Sarah froze for a microsecond as she poured Brad's water. She willed herself to be invisible. She was witnessing history. "I have decided," Aubert continued, "that one of the three of you will take over the company effective Monday morning. The other two will be terminated." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah finished pouring and stepped back into the shadows, clutching her tray against her chest. "Terminated?" Brad laughed nervously. "You can't be serious. I just made the company 40% growth in Q3. "And Richard is family," Julianne added quickly, glancing at the nephew. "Family?" Albert muttered, looking at Richard with disappointment. "Yes, blood is thick, but competence is rarer." Albert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it on the table. "Tonight is a celebration," he said, "but it is also a test. By the end of this meal, I will know who has the character to lead my legacy." The three candidates stared at the box, greed, naked and ugly, washing over their faces. They had forgotten the old man. They had forgotten the restaurant. And they certainly had no idea that the waitress standing in the corner was the most important person in the room. The atmosphere in the obsidian room shifted from tense to predatory. Richard, Julianne, and Brad were no longer colleagues. They were gladiators in a pit, and Albert was the emperor. "Let's order," Albert said, waving a hand. Sarah stepped forward instantly. "Good evening. Tonight, the chef has prepared a tasting menu featuring—" "Skip it," Richard interrupted, waving her away without making eye contact. "I want the filet, rare, and tell the chef if it's medium rare, I'm sending it back and he's paying for it." "I'll have the lobster risotto," Julianne said, looking at her phone. "No dairy. I know it's risotto. Figure it out. Use oil instead of butter." "And for you, sir?" Sarah asked Brad. Brad looked her up and down. Not sexually, but appraisingly, like one would look at a piece of furniture that was slightly scratched. "Just bring me whatever is most expensive and bring a bottle of the 82 Waitress. Put it on the company tab." "And for you, Mr. Sterling?" Sarah asked the old man, her voice softening. She noticed his hands were shaking as he held the menu. Albert looked up at her. It was the first time anyone at the table had actually looked her in the eyes. "I will have the soup, my dear. Just the tomato soup and a warm tea." "Of course," Sarah said. As she turned to leave, Richard laughed. "Soup? Come on, Uncle. Live a little. It's your last hurrah, right?" Albert ignored him. "That girl," Albert said as Sarah exited the curtains. "She looks tired." "Who?" Julianne asked, checking her makeup in a compact mirror. "The waitress." "Oh," Julianne shrugged. "I didn't notice. It's hard to find good help these days. They all look tired because they're all out partying all night." "Actually," Brad chuckled, "I think she's the one who messed up my coffee order last time I was here." Incompetent. Sarah was standing just on the other side of the velvet curtain. She heard every word. She felt the sting of tears but swallowed them down. Incompetent. She was top of her class in nursing school before she had to drop out to care for her mom. She worked double shifts 6 days a week. She took a deep breath, composed her face, and walked to the kitchen. "Order in," she called out. The kitchen was a war zone of shouting chefs and clanging pans. While waiting for the appetizers, Sarah leaned against the counter and checked her phone again. One new message from the hospital. "Ms. Miller, we need to confirm payment by 9:00 a.m. tomorrow." She closed her eyes. She felt like she was drowning. When she returned to the table with the appetizers, the dynamic had shifted. They were arguing about a merger in Tokyo. "It's a hostile takeover," Brad was saying aggressively, cutting a piece of bread. "We gut the workforce, sell the assets, and triple the stock price." "It's risky," Julianne countered. "The unions will riot." "Let them riot," Richard sneered. "They're peasants. They need us more than we need them." Sarah placed the soup in front of Albert. As she did, the old man's hands spasmed. His spoon clattered onto the floor, and a splash of hot soup landed on his tuxedo cuff. "Oh, you clumsy oaf!" Richard shouted, jumping up, though the soup hadn't touched him. "Look what you did to him." Sarah panicked. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling. It was my fault, Albert said quietly, holding up a hand. My hand slipped. Nonsense, Julianne said, glaring at Sarah. She bumped you, I saw it. Get a towel now. Sarah rushed to the side station, grabbed a warm towel and returned. She knelt beside Albert. Unlike the others who were worried about the suit, Sarah looked at Albert's hand. The skin was red where the soup had splashed. Sir, are you burned? She asked softly, ignoring Richard's ranting. May I? Albert nodded. Sarah gently dabbed the soup away with the wet cloth, then wrapped a clean napkin around the red spot with the professional dexterity of a nurse. This will keep the air off it until I can get some burn cream from the first aid kit. I'm fine, child, Albert said, looking at her with an intensity that made her shiver. Thank you. Get away from him, Richard snapped. You've done enough damage. Go get the manager. I want you fired. Sarah's heart stopped. Sir, please. It was an accident. I really need this job. I don't care what you need, Richard spat. You ruined a $5,000 suit. Get out. Albert cleared his throat. It was a dry, crackling sound. Sit down, Richard. But uncle, I said sit down. Richard sat, sulking. The girl stays, Albert said firmly, and she will serve the rest of the meal. Albert, really, Julianne sighed. We're trying to have a serious business discussion. We don't need this distraction. She is not a distraction, Albert said, dipping his spoon into the remaining soup. She is the only person who asked if I was hurt. You three were worried about the suit. The table went silent. Brad rolled his eyes, taking a massive gulp of the expensive wine. He's getting senile, he muttered under his breath. Just loud enough for Julianne to hear, but too quiet for Albert. Albert heard it. Sarah saw his jaw tighten. The test had officially begun, and the first round was over. The guests had failed, but the night was young, and Albert Sterling had much darker games to play. The main courses arrived. The filet for Richard, the customized risotto for Julianne, and the lobster thermidor for Brad. Sarah moved like a ghost, terrified of making another sound. Every time she reached across the table, she felt Richard's eyes burning holes into her uniform. Albert ate slowly. He seemed to be fading. His head bobbed, and his speech was becoming slurred. The quarterly reports, Albert mumbled, trailing off. He's losing it, Brad whispered to Julianne. Look at him. He won't last the night. Good, Richard muttered, cutting his steak. The sooner he signs the papers, the sooner we can get him into a home and get on with business. Sarah was refilling the water glasses when she heard this. A surge of anger rose in her chest. How could they talk about their own family like this? Like he was an expired asset to be liquidated. Suddenly, Albert's arm swept across the table in a violent spasm. Crash. The bottle of 82 Waitress, worth $4,000, shattered against the edge of the table. Red wine exploded everywhere, all over the white tablecloth, all over the floor, and splashing onto Julianne's cream-colored silk dress. My dress! Julianne shrieked, jumping up. You senile old bat! Look what you've done! My God, Albert! Richard slammed his fist on the table. Can't you control yourself? That was a $4,000 bottle. What a waste, Brad yelled. Albert slumped in his chair, looking small and confused. I don't feel well. I need my medicine. We'll take it then, Richard snapped. Where is it? It's in my coat. In the car. Albert wheezed. Please, Richard, get it. Richard looked at the rain pounding against the window outside. It's pouring out there, Albert. I'm not running out in a monsoon because you forgot your pills. Just drink some water. You'll be fine. Albert looked at Julianne. Julianne, please. Julianne was busy dabbing at her dress with a napkin, her face twisted in fury. I can't believe this stains. This is vintage Chanel. I'm not going anywhere, Albert. Ask the help to do it. Albert looked at Brad. Brad laughed. Don't look at me, old man. I'm wearing Italian suede loafers. Water ruins them. Albert began to cough, a wet, hacking sound. He clutched his chest. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She dropped her tray on the side station. Protocol be damned. Her job be damned. She rushed to Albert's side. Mr. Sterling, sir, look at me. She checked his pulse. It was erratic. I'll go, Sarah said firmly. Where's the car, sir? The black Bentley, out front, Albert gasped. Driver has the bag, blue pills. I'll be right back, Sarah said. Hey! Henry, the manager, stormed into the room, alerted by the noise of the breaking glass. Miller, what is going on here? Look at this mess. Mr. Sterling needs his medication, Sarah said, moving toward the door. You are not to leave the floor during service, Henri barked. Clean up this wine immediately. Sarah looked at Henri, then at the three wealthy guests sitting there wiping wine off their clothes while their benefactor gasped for air. Fire me if you want, Henri, Sarah said, her voice shaking but loud. But I'm getting his medicine. She turned and ran. She burst out the front door into the freezing rain. She didn't have a coat. The icy water soaked her uniform instantly, chilling her to the bone. She scanned the line of cars for a black Bentley. She ran to the driver's window and banged on the glass. The driver, a large man with a stoic face, rolled it down. "Mr. Sterling," she shouted over the wind. "He needs his pills, the blue ones." The driver stared at her for a moment. A strange look crossed his face, not urgency, but something like respect. He calmly reached into the passenger seat and handed her a small brown leather bag. "Run," the driver said. Sarah grabbed the bag and sprinted back toward the restaurant. She slipped on the wet pavement, scraping her knee hard against the concrete. Blood began to seep through her tights, mixing with the rain. She ignored the pain. She scrambled up and burst back into the warmth of the restaurant, dripping wet, bleeding, and shivering. She ran into the obsidian room. The guests were still complaining. "I'm sending the dry cleaning bill to the estate," Julianne was saying. Sarah ignored them. She knelt beside Albert. "I got them, sir. Here." She opened the bottle, took out a pill, and helped him drink it with a glass of water. Albert swallowed. He took a few deep breaths. The coughing subsided. He leaned back, closing his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're soaking wet, child." "I'm fine," Sarah said, shivering uncontrollably. Her hair was plastered to her face. "She's dripping on the floor," Richard pointed out with disgust. "Can we get someone to mop this up? It's unhygienic." Albert opened his eyes. The frailty was gone for a fleeting second, replaced by a cold, hard rage, but he masked it quickly. "Sarah," Albert said, using her name for the first time. "You're bleeding." He pointed to her knee. "It's just a scratch," she said. "Sit," Albert commanded. He pointed to the empty chair next to him, the seat meant for a fourth guest who never arrived. "Sir, I can't sit. I have to serve." "I own the building," Albert said softly. "Sit." Sarah sat, perched on the edge of the velvet chair. From al front of the chair, water pooling around her shoes. "Now," Albert said, looking at his three potential heirs, "we have a problem." Before I had my episode, I realized something. He patted his jacket pockets. He patted his pants pockets. His face went pale. "My ring," Albert said, "my signet ring. The Sterling family crest. It's gone." Richard rolled his eyes. "You probably dropped it when you were flailing around breaking wine bottles." "No," Albert said firmly. "I took it off to wash my hands before dinner. I put it on the table right here." He pointed to a spot near the center of the table. "It's not there now," Brad said. Albert looked slowly around the table, his eyes locking on Sarah, then Richard, then Julianne, then Brad. "It is a ring from 1890. It is priceless, and someone at this table stole it." "Are you accusing us?" Julianne gasped. "We are millionaires, Albert. Why would we steal your old ring?" "Kleptomania aside," Albert shrugged. "Or maybe," he turned his gaze to Sarah, who was shivering in the chair. "Maybe desperation." Richard's eyes lit up. He pointed a finger at Sarah. "Of course. It was her, the help. She's been hovering around the table all night. She leaned over to clean your hand. She was the only one close enough." "I didn't," Sarah cried out, horrified. "I would never." "She needs money," Brad chimed in, pulling up something on his phone. "I just did a quick background check. Isn't technology wonderful?" Sarah Miller dropped out of nursing school. "Lots of debt, and oh, look at this. A mother in St. Jude's cardiac wing. Expensive." Brad grinned, showing his teeth. "She stole the ring to pay for Mommy's heart surgery." The room went deadly silent. Sarah felt like the floor was opening up underneath her. "How did he know?" "Is this true, Sarah?" Albert asked, his voice unreadable. "My mother is sick," Sarah said, tears mixing with the rainwater on her face. "But I didn't steal your ring, Mr. Sterling. I swear on her life I am not a thief." "We'll see about that," Richard said, standing up. "Henri, call the police. And while you're at it, have this girl searched." Sarah stood up, trembling. "You can't do that." "I can do whatever I want," Richard hissed. "I'm a Sterling. You're nobody." Albert Sterling sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in his lap. He said nothing. He watched Sarah's face. He saw the terror, but he also saw something else. Dignity. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging. She was enduring. The arrival of the police was not subtle. Two officers, wet from the rain and looking irritated at having been called to a high-end restaurant for a theft during a storm, marched into the obsidian room. They were led by Henri, who looked as though he was about to have a stroke. "This is the table," Henri squeaked, pointing a trembling finger. "Mr. Sterling is the victim." Officer Kowalski, a burly man with a tired face, took out a notebook. "All right, who's accusing who?" "I am," Richard announced, stepping forward and adjusting his cufflinks. "I am Richard Sterling. This is my uncle, Albert Sterling. That woman," he pointed a sharp finger at Sarah, who was standing against the wall, hugging her arms around herself, "stole a family heirloom, a signet ring. Value is inestimable, but likely over $50,000. Kowalski looked at Sarah. She looked small, wet, and terrified. Her uniform was still damp from her run in the rain, and the blood on her knee had dried into a dark crust. "Did you take the ring, ma'am?" Kowalski asked. "No," Sarah's voice cracked. "I swear, I didn't touch it." "She's lying," Julianne interjected, sipping a fresh glass of wine. "She's desperate for money. We know she has debts, motive, and opportunity. It's an open and shut case, officer. Arrest her." "We don't just arrest people because you say so, ma'am," Kowalski said dryly. He turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, do you mind if we search your person and your belongings?" Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The humiliation was physical, to be searched like a criminal in front of the most powerful people in the city, in the place where she worked. I have nothing to hide," Sarah whispered. "Good," Richard said. "Search her thoroughly. She probably hid it in her undergarments. These types are crafty." Albert Sterling sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in his lap. He said nothing. He watched Sarah's face. He saw the terror, but he also saw something else. Dignity. Officer Kowalski nodded to his partner, a female officer named Perez. "Check her pockets and her bag." Perez approached Sarah. "I need you to empty your pockets, miss." With trembling hands, Sarah reached into her apron. She pulled out a pen, an ordering pad, and a crumpled tissue. Then she reached into her trouser pockets. She pulled out her phone and a folded piece of paper. "What's that?" Richard demanded, leaning in. Officer Perez unfolded the paper. She read it, and her expression softened. She looked at Sarah with pity. "It's a billing statement," Perez said. "From St. Jude's Hospital, past due notice." Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. "See, I told you she's broke. She needs cash fast. She took the ring to pay the bill." "It's obvious." "Where's your bag?" Perez asked. "In the staff locker room," Sarah said. "Bring it here," Richard commanded Henry. Henri ran and returned a minute later with Sarah's worn-out tote bag. He dumped the contents onto the pristine tablecloth of the obsidian room. It was a pathetic display of poverty against the backdrop of luxury: a stick of chapstick, a bus pass, a spare pair of socks, a granola bar, her dinner, and a bottle of generic ibuprofen. There was no ring. "She hid it," Brad said, looking up from his phone. "She went outside, remember, to get the medicine." He made air quotes. "She probably handed it off to an accomplice or stashed it in a planter outside." "I went to get his heart medication because he was dying," Sarah cried out, her voice finally rising in anger. "I saved his life while you three worried about your shoes." "Don't take that tone with me," Brad sneered. "You're a waitress. You're serviceable. You're replaceable. And you're a thief." "Check the car," Richard told the police. "Check the planter outside. It has to be there." Officer Kowalski sighed. "Look, Mr. Sterling, we can look around outside, but unless we find the ring on her, we can't arrest her." He said, she said. "Do you know who I am?" Richard stepped into Kowalski's personal space. "I can have your badge. I can have this precinct shut down and turned into a parking lot. Find the ring." Kowalski stiffened. He didn't like being threatened. "Officer?" Albert Sterling spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. His voice was stronger now, the raspiness gone. "Stop the search." "Uncle, don't be soft," Richard said. "She has it." "I said stop," Albert repeated. The command cracked like a whip across the room. Albert stood up. He didn't use the table for leverage. He didn't wobble. He stood straight, his spine aligning with a military precision that shed 20 years off his appearance. He reached into the small breast pocket of his tuxedo, the pocket right over his heart. He pulled out a gold ring with a black onyx stone. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the rain against the glass. You had it," Julianne stammered, her face draining of color. "I never lost it." Albert said calmly, slipping the ring back onto his finger. But why? Brad asked, confused. Why make us go through all this? Why call the police? I didn't call the police, Albert said. Richard did. Albert looked at the two officers. I apologize for the waste of taxpayer money, officers. My nephew is an idiot. Please send the bill for the disturbance to Sterling Industries, and please take a warm meal from the kitchen on your way out. Kowalski looked from the old man to the red-faced Richard. He chuckled. No problem, Mr. Sterling. Have a good night. The officers turned and left, looking relieved to escape the toxicity of the room. Now it was just the five of them, and the air in the room became heavy, suffocating. A test, Richard whispered, realization dawning on him. It was another test. Yes, Albert said, and you failed, all of you. He turned to Sarah. She was crying now, silent tears of relief and lingering shock. Sarah, Albert said gently, please stop crying. Sit down. I should go, sir. I should get back to work. You are done working, Albert said. At least you are done working for Henri. Albert clapped his hands twice. The heavy velvet curtains at the back of the room, not the entrance, but a service partition, parted. A man stepped out. It was the driver, but he wasn't wearing a chauffeur's cap anymore. He was wearing a tailored suit and carrying a briefcase. This, Albert said, gesturing to the man, is Mr. Marcus Stone. He is not my driver. He is the chief legal counsel for Sterling Industries. Marcus Stone nodded to the group. He placed the briefcase on the table, pushing aside the remains of the lobster and the spilled wine. The papers are ready, Albert, Marcus said. Good. Albert looked at his three potential heirs. Sit down. We are going to have a board meeting right now. Richard, Julianne, and Brad sat down slowly. They looked like children called to the principal's office, but with millions of dollars on the line. Tonight was not a dinner, Albert began, pacing slowly around the table. It was an autopsy of your characters, and the results are terminal. He stopped behind Richard. Richard flinched. Richard, my blood, my nephew. Albert put a hand on Richard's shoulder. When the soup spilled, your first reaction was not concern for my burnt skin. It was concern for the suit. You yelled at the girl. You belittled her. It was an expensive suit, Uncle, and she was clumsy. Shut up, Albert continued, ignoring him. When the wine bottle broke, you refused to get my medicine. You said, I'm not running out in a monsoon. You let a stranger, a girl you had been insulting all night, run into the freezing rain to save my life while you sat here and ate steak. Albert squeezed Richard's shoulder hard, causing him to wince. You are cruel, Richard. You mistake cruelty for strength. You think leading a company means barking orders and stepping on the little people. But the little people are the foundation. If you treat the foundation like dirt, the building collapses. Albert moved to Julianne. Julianne, you have been with the company for 15 years. I have been loyal, Albert, she said, her voice shaking. Loyal to your paycheck, Albert corrected. Loyal to your image. When the wine hit your dress, you shrieked. You called me a senile old bat. You were more worried about vintage Chanel than the fact that your CEO was apparently having a heart attack. Albert leaned in close to her. You lack empathy. You are vain. A leader who cannot look past their own reflection cannot see the cliff they are walking the company off of. Finally, Albert stood in front of Brad. Brad was sweating. He tried to smile. Albert, come on. I'm the numbers guy. I made you millions. You are a predator, Brad, Albert said coldly. You didn't just insult Sarah. You background checked her. You weaponized her tragedy against her. You found out her mother was dying, and instead of feeling compassion, you used it as evidence to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. Albert picked up the billing statement that was still on the table. You saw a woman drowning in debt trying to save her mother, and you tried to push her head under the water. That is not business, Brad. That is evil. Brad swallowed hard. It was due diligence. It was psychopathy, Albert retorted. Albert walked back to the head of the table. He looked at Sarah, who was watching this scene with wide eyes, unsure if she was dreaming. Sarah, Albert said, please come here. Sarah stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. She walked to the head of the table. Tell them, Albert said to her. Tell them what you did today before you came to work. I went to the hospital, Sarah whispered. And before that, I donated blood. Albert nodded. She donated blood. Then she went to sit with her mother. Then she came here to work a 10-hour shift on her feet. And when I dropped my spoon, she was the only one who looked at my hand. When I couldn't breathe, she ran into the storm. When she was accused of a felony, she didn't scream or fight. She stood with dignity. Albert turned to Marcus Stone. Read the amendment, Marcus. Marcus Stone opened the leather folder. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud, his voice steady and legalistic. Effective immediately, the entirety of the Sterling Industries controlling interest previously held by Albert Sterling is placed into a blind trust. The sole beneficiary of the trust and the newly appointed chairperson of the Sterling Philanthropic Foundation, with a starting salary of $500,000 per annum, is Miss Sarah Miller. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the silence of the storm. "What?" Richard screamed, jumping up and knocking his chair over. "Her? The waitress? You're giving her the money?" "Not the company," Albert corrected. "The company will be run by a board of directors that I have selected over the last year. Competent people, boring people, people who don't throw wine glasses." Albert smiled, a genuine warm smile. "But the foundation, the heart of the Sterling legacy, the billions we give to charity, to research, to hospitals, that requires a human heart. And Sarah has the biggest one I have ever seen." "This is insane," Julianne yelled. "She's a nobody. She didn't even finish nursing school." "She will now," Albert said. "I will contest this," Brad threatened, his face red. "I'll sue. I'll prove you were mentally incompetent when you made this decision." Albert laughed. "I knew you would say that. That's why I had Dr. Aris verify my sanity this morning. And that is why this entire dinner was recorded." Albert pointed to the chandelier. A tiny red light blinked among the crystals. "Audio and video." Albert said, "Every insult, every threat, every moment of your negligence. If you sue, I will release the tape to the press. Imagine what the shareholders will think when they see the CFO mocking a dying man and framing a poor girl. You'll never work on Wall Street again." Brad sat down. He was defeated. He knew the game was over. "Now," Albert said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "get out." "Albert," Richard began. "Get out!" Albert roared, slamming his hand on the table with surprising force. "Get out of my sight. You are fired, all of you. Pack your desks by morning. Security has already been notified to revoke your badges at midnight." The three of them stood up. Richard looked at Sarah with pure hatred, but he didn't say a word. He turned and stormed out. Julianne followed, clutching her stained Chanel dress. Brad grabbed his phone, looking at the floor, and scurried out like a rat. When they were gone, the room felt instantly lighter. The oppressive energy had vanished. Albert slumped back into his chair. He looked tired now, really tired. The adrenaline was fading. Sarah stood there trembling. She looked at Marcus Stone, then at Albert. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice barely audible, I can't accept this. I'm just a waitress." "You are not just a waitress," Albert said softly. "You are the person who saved me tonight, and not just with the pills." He gestured for her to sit in the chair Richard had vacated. "Sarah, I have been looking for an heir for 10 years. I didn't want a shark. I have enough sharks. I wanted someone who understands what it means to suffer and still be kind. That is the rarest thing in this world. But the money, the job, I don't know how to do any of that." "Marcus will teach you," Albert said, nodding to the lawyer. "He's very good, boring but good." Marcus smiled. "It would be an honor, Ms. Miller." Albert reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. His skin was paper thin, but his grip was warm. "There is one condition," Albert said. Sarah held her breath. "What is it?" "You must quit this job immediately, and you must let me pay for your mother's surgery tomorrow." Sarah burst into tears. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed. It was the release of months of stress, fear, and exhaustion. "Why?" she choked out. "Why me?" "Because," Albert said, looking at the empty wine glass on the table, "when everyone else looked at the table and saw profit, you looked at the table and saw people. You passed the test, Sarah. You were the only one who didn't know it was a test, which is exactly why you passed." Albert stood up, leaning heavily on Marcus. "Come," Albert said. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes. My car is waiting. We have a hospital to visit. I think your mother would like to know that her surgery is paid for." Sarah stood up. She untied her apron, the symbol of her servitude, the shield she had worn for years. She folded it neatly and placed it on the table right next to the empty velvet box. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She walked out of the obsidian room, not behind Albert Sterling, but beside him. The silence inside the Bentley Mulsanne was absolute. It was a hermetically sealed world of hand-stitched leather and walnut veneer, completely isolated from the storm that still raged outside. For Sarah Miller, the contrast was jarring. Less than an hour ago, she had been standing on aching feet, soaked in rainwater and humiliation, holding a tray of dirty dishes. Now she was sinking into a seat that cost more than her mother's entire lifetime of earnings. Sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the Western Hemisphere, Albert Sterling had wrapped himself in a cashmere blanket drawn from a compartment in the armrest. He looked smaller now, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading, leaving behind a fragile old man. But his eyes remained bright, fixed on the rain streaking the tinted windows. "You're staring at your hands, Sarah," Albert said softly, breaking the silence. Sarah flinched. She unclasped her hands, which were resting on her lap, red, chapped from years of washing dishes and scrubbing tables with the fingernails cut short and practical. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," she whispered. "I keep waiting for Henri to yell at me for sleeping in the break room." "Henri won't be yelling at anyone," Aubert murmured. "I just sent a text to the owner of the Gilded Lily. I bought the building 3 years ago, though they don't know that. Henri will be reassigned to the mailroom of a logistics center in New Jersey by tomorrow morning." Sarah looked at him wide-eyed. "You don't have to do that." "I don't have to do anything," Albert corrected her gently. "That is the privilege of my position. But I choose to remove weeds so that flowers can grow." Henri was a weed. Richard, Julianne, and Brad were weeds. "You, my dear, are the first flower I have found in this concrete jungle in a decade." The car glided to a halt. They weren't at a mansion or a hotel. They were at the private entrance of St. Jude's Cardiac Center. Sarah's breath hitched. "My mom—" "Marcus phoned ahead," Albert said as the driver opened the door. "Dr. Evans is waiting for us." While Sarah was walking into the hospital, a very different scene was unfolding across town at the Sterling Industries headquarters. It was 8:00 a.m. the morning after the dinner. The rain had stopped, leaving the city scrubbed clean and gray. Richard Sterling stepped out of his Porsche, adjusting his tie. He had convinced himself that the previous night had been a bluff, a senile episode. Old Uncle Artie would calm down, realize his mistake, and beg Richard to come back to manage the Tokyo merger. After all, Richard was family. You don't fire family. He walked up to the glass turnstiles of the massive skyscraper, flanked by Julianne and Brad. They looked hungover and anxious, but Richard exuded a desperate confidence. "Just act normal," Richard hissed. He was off his meds. "We go up, we shred the files on the hostess, and we pretend it never happened." Richard slapped his security badge against the reader. Beep, beep, beep. A red light flashed. "Access denied." "Damn thing," Richard muttered. He tried again. "Access denied." "Mine isn't working either," Julianne said, her voice trembling as she tapped her card frantically against the scanner. "Nor mine," Brad whispered, his face pale. "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" The voice came from the other side of the turnstiles. It wasn't the usual sleepy security guard. It was the head of corporate security, a former FBI agent named Vance, a man Richard had ignored for 5 years. Behind him stood two uniformed officers. "My badge is demagnetized," Richard snapped. "Vance, buzz us in. We have a meeting." "You don't have a meeting," Vance said, his voice echoing in the cavernous marble lobby. "And you don't have a job." "Excuse me." Julianne stepped forward, trying to summon her usual arrogance. "I am the vice president of operations. You can't speak to me like that." Vance held up a tablet. "As of midnight last night, your contracts were terminated for cause: gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and in Mr. Holloway's case," he nodded at Brad, "misappropriation of company resources for illegal background checks." "This is a mistake," Richard shouted, causing people in the lobby to turn and stare. "I demand to see my uncle." "Mr. Sterling left specific instructions," Vance said calmly. He reached behind the desk and pulled out 3 cardboard boxes. He slid them across the polished floor. They stopped at Richard's feet. "Your personal effects have already been cleared from your offices. We mailed your diplomas to your home addresses. These boxes contain the items you can't leave without, mostly breath mints and phone chargers from what I saw." "You can't do this!" Richard screamed, his face turning purple. "I'll sue. I own this place." "Actually," Vance said, a small smile playing on his lips, "the legal owner of the controlling trust changed hands this morning. We received the memo at 7:00 a.m. The new chairperson is a Ms. Sarah Miller." Brad gasped. Julianne covered her mouth. "The waitress," Richard whispered, the reality finally shattering his delusion. "Please take your box and leave," Vance said, his hand resting near his belt. If you are not off the premises in 2 minutes, you will be escorted out for trespassing. And Mr. Moore Sterling, the company car you parked out front has been remotely disabled. You might want to call an Uber. Defeated, crushed, and publicly shamed, the three former titans of Wall Street picked up their cardboard boxes. As they walked out the revolving doors, a camera crew from CNBC was waiting. Albert had thought of everything. Inside the VIP wing of St. Jude's, the air smelled of lavender, not antiseptic. Sarah stood by the bedside, her hand clutching her mother's limp fingers. The rhythmic whoosh beep of the ventilator was the only sound in the room. Her mother, Martha, looked small in the bed, but her color was already better. The gray pallor of heart failure was replaced by the flush of circulation. The valve replacement was successful, Dr. Evans said. He was a tall man with silver hair, the kind of surgeon you usually had to wait 6 months to see. And we repaired the arterial damage. She's strong, Sarah. She's going to wake up in an hour or so. Sarah looked at the doctor. Yesterday, your billing department told me they were going to cancel her slot. Dr. Evans looked down at his clipboard, embarrassed. The administration can be rigid, but Mr. Sterling's office contacted us directly. The bill has been paid in full, including post-operative care and rehabilitation for the next 6 months. Sarah turned to Albert, who was sitting in a recliner in the corner of the room, sipping a cup of tea. He looked out of place in the hospital room, yet perfectly at home in the role of guardian angel. Why? Sarah asked again, the question that had been burning in her chest. You saw me for one night. I brought you soup. I gave you a pill. That's it. How can you trust me with all of this? Albert set his tea down. He motioned for Marcus Stone, the lawyer, just the lawyer, to step forward. Marcus, show her the file. Marcus opened his briefcase and handed Sarah a thin manila folder. Sarah opened it. It wasn't a contract. It was a photograph. It was a grainy black and white photo from 40 years ago. It showed a young Albert Sterling standing on a construction site, looking dirty and exhausted. Next to him was a woman handing him a sandwich. That was my wife, Eleonora, Albert said, his voice thick with emotion. I wasn't always a billionaire, Sarah. I started as a bricklayer. I was broke. I was hungry. Eleonora was a waitress at the diner across the street. She used to sneak me sandwiches when I couldn't afford lunch. She never asked for money. She never asked for my name. She just saw a hungry man and fed him. Albert's eyes misted over. She passed away 10 years ago. Since then, I have been surrounded by people who want to take, people who see me as a checkbook, not a human being. Last night when I looked at you, I didn't see a waitress. I saw Eleonora. I saw that same spark, the refusal to let someone suffer even when it costs you. That is not a skill you can teach in business school, Sarah. That is a soul. Sarah looked at the photo, then at Albert. Tears streamed down her face. She walked over and knelt beside his chair, taking his withered hand in hers. I won't let you down, Mr. Sterling. I promise. I know you won't. Albert smiled. And please call me Albert. We have a lot of work to do. The foundation has become stagnant. I want to build hospitals, not just fund them. I want to create scholarships for nurses who have to drop out because of bills. I want to change the system that almost killed your mother. We can do that? Sarah asked. Albert chuckled, a mischievous glint returning to his eye. My dear, with the resources you now control, we can move mountains, or at least we can make sure no one in this city ever has to choose between rent and medicine again. A soft groan from the bed broke the moment. Sarah scrambled to her feet and rushed to the bed. Mom, can you hear me? Martha Miller's eyelids fluttered. Slowly, groggily, they opened. She blinked against the light, trying to focus. Her eyes found Sarah's. Sarah! Her voice was a rasp, barely a whisper. Did I make it? Yes, Mom. Sarah sobbed, stroking her mother's hair. You made it. You're okay. Everything is okay. Martha looked around the room, confused by the luxury of the private suite. Her eyes landed on the old man in the tuxedo sitting in the corner. Who is that? Sarah smiled through her tears. She looked at Albert, then back at her mother. That's Albert, Sarah said. He's a friend. He's family. Albert bowed his head respectfully. It is an honor to meet you, Martha. You raised a remarkable daughter. Martha squeezed Sarah's hand, her grip weak but steady. She's a good girl. She works too hard. Not anymore, Sarah whispered, kissing her mother's forehead. Not anymore. The transition wasn't easy. The media storm was intense. The Waitress Billionaire was on every magazine cover for months. But Sarah didn't retreat. With Marcus Stone guiding her on the legalities and Albert mentoring her on strategy, she learned fast. She applied the same work ethic she had used to survive double shifts at the Gilded Lily to running the Sterling Philanthropic Foundation. She didn't buy a yacht. She didn't buy a mansion. She bought her mother a nice house with a garden in the suburbs. She finished her nursing degree, not because she needed the job, but because she wanted to finish what she started. And every Tuesday night, rain or shine, she had dinner with Albert. They didn't go to the Gilded Lily. They sat in Albert's kitchen eating grilled cheese sandwiches, talking about how to save the world, one act of kindness at a time. Albert lived for another 3 years longer than the doctors had predicted. He often said it was because he finally had a reason to wake up in the morning. When he eventually passed peacefully in his sleep, he left the world with no heirs by blood, but with a legacy that would last for generations. Richard, Julianne Bush, and Brad faded into obscurity. In the shadowed elegance of the Gilded Lily, where fortunes are measured in billions and hearts are often weighed in gold, Sarah Miller stood as the quiet proof that true worth is never found on a balance sheet. A young waitress drowning in medical debt, fighting to save her dying mother, she served soup to an elderly billionaire not because he was powerful, but because he was human. When his hand trembled and soup spilled, she didn't see a stained tuxedo, she saw pain. While the heirs-to-be sneered, calculated, and schemed, Sarah knelt, soothed, and ran through freezing rain to fetch medicine, bleeding and soaked, yet never once asking for reward. That single act of selfless kindness, unseen, unrecorded, unrewarded, became the mirror that revealed the rot in the souls of those who thought they were destined to inherit an empire. Albert Sterling didn't choose blood or ambition. He chose character. In Sarah, he saw the echo of his late wife, the rare soul who feeds the hungry without expecting a tip, who comforts the frail without calculating the cost. This story breaks the heart because it reminds us how easily we overlook the invisible people, the waitresses, the caregivers, the quiet ones carrying invisible burdens, while we chase status and power. Yet it is in their quiet courage, their refusal to let cruelty win, that real legacy is born. Sarah didn't steal a ring. She earned a kingdom by simply choosing compassion when no one was watching. In a world obsessed with being seen, the greatest victory is being kind when no one will ever know. May we all learn from her. The measure of a life is not how much we accumulate, but how much we care when it costs us everything. What moved you most in Sarah's journey? Have you ever witnessed or given an act of kindness that changed someone's path forever? Share your stories in the comments. I read every single one, and they inspire me deeply. If tales like this remind you that goodness still wins, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story that restores your faith in humanity. Let's keep spreading light together.